So, Father, we thank you for this evening where we can all join. We ask you bless Cindy's words, open our hearts and minds, guide us by your Holy Spirit, that we may understand even more deeply the mysteries of your creation, the wonders that you have made. Make us your servants more dutifully, more carefully, more dedicatedly. Amen.
Amen.
Is dedicatedly a word? I'm not quite sure, but I guess it works. Well, Cindy Crysdale has retired from the School of Theology here at Sewanee, the University of the South, where I'm located, and a wonderful colleague. And we've taught together, and so glad she's consented to be with us tonight. She splits her life now between Sewanee and Canada. And she's a snowbird in that she comes halfway down, not to Florida, but back to Tennessee as it starts to get colder. So, and I think she's currently spending her ministry now is largely spiritual direction, which has been a long time interest of hers. And so, Cindy, I think I'll turn it over to you and look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. I was happy when Robin asked me. I thought a lot about what I could do, and I do have a PowerPoint we'll go through. You'll have to bear with me. I used to tell my students, if your head isn't hurting by the time we're done, then we haven't been successful. So I am going to test my technology here and see if I can get that started. Okay, can everyone see that?
That's good.
Yes.
Okay. Well, like I said, bear with me. These are two pieces of my career. I spent a good bit of time doing some religion and science, and particularly working on this whole question of evolution and chance. So that's one piece of it. And then I've also written a couple of books on how do we make sense of the cross. So when Robin, and in my retirement, I have done some teaching, and last winter I taught again a course on the Atonement. So when Robin said, could you do something for us? The Atonement thing was sort of in the forefront of my mind. But so this has been a challenge for me, like, oh, how do these things fit together? So you're a bit guinea pigs for me, but I do ask you to bear with me because there's a lot of hard thinking going on here. So first move, evolution is the interaction of chance and order. I co-wrote a book. It was published at Fortress Press in 2013 called Creator God, Evolving World. Neil is in Australia, taught at the Catholic University of Australia for many years. And this was great fun because we would each write something and then we'd have calls and discussions, and it was all great. I think a lot of the thing was to deal with, evolution still in many circles is controversial as being seen as something that goes against a religion. And I always had a sense that couldn't or shouldn't or wasn't the case. So this was a chance to explore that. So you're just getting a little bit of this here. So we're going to start with this false assumption that often occurs, I think is at the root of some of the controversy, assuming that there is this dichotomy and we're talking about how the world unfolds here. So there is this assumption that either it's all an accident, it's all chance, and therefore all meaningless, or God made it like it is. So we have sheer chance versus law-like certitude. And the law-like certitude is what you have to believe if you want to be a believer in God. And this sheer chance is what the enlightened ones say, oh, well, of course, then it's just random. There's no God, there's no meaning. So But what Neil and I did, and what I want to propose is that this is indeed a false assumption. So I'm going to introduce the notion of emergent probability. Things emerge, but they merge according to schedules of probability. So in terms of the way the world unfolds, that dichotomy, one or the other, is wrong. And in fact, the way the world unfolds is the interaction of regularities, what we call the laws of nature, and probabilities, what some people would call chance. So to get at these, we have two different ways of studying the regularities and the probability. Classical science is what studies the regularities. Those are what we call the laws of nature. Classical science begins with a whole lot of instances of some phenomenon, and then tries to understand what causes one, let's just say a chemical reaction. What is it that causes this thing to change into that thing if you introduce this certain chemical? And then from those specifics, from those concrete things, you abstract. And you get into generalities of, well, here's the law. Here's when this happens, this always unfolds. So you start with specifics. And then, of course, if not all the specifics, if you get cases that don't fit that explanation, you have to go back and say, well, is there something else going on there? And you have to go back to the concrete and figure out, all right, what else is going on here? But you're always moving from these specific instances to these generalizations. And what you're after is something that is a law, that happens all the time, that we can explain this on a regular basis. Things fall off roofs. This is the law of gravity. So how do we explain that? The physics of a home run, how do we explain those? So once you understand these, then you assume that they are going to keep operating whenever there are instances of that kind. The one thing is that these laws always involve the caveat, all things being equal, which is the little bit of a blink to the side to say, oh, well, wait a minute, sometimes everything isn't equal. So some of these laws, for different reasons, aren't true forever, for always. There are conditions under which they do occur. So that's what most people think about when they think of science. We can think of, now we're in the era of COVID, and if you just think of those years of COVID, of all that research to try and understand what kind of an infection it was, where it came from, how it was transmitted. I just finished listening to Anthony Fauci's memoir. It's called On Call. And if you ever get a chance to read it or listen to, it's just fascinating because it's his whole life. Begins with AIDS, but it's a series, from AIDS to Ebola to COVID. All these different mysteries they kept trying to solve. And through this classical science type of research. Okay, now, in addition to this, we have statistical science. Now, statistical science is a science. It does come up with generalizations, but it has a different set of questions that it asks. It counts events. So instead of what is happening or why or how does something occur, what's the causal agent involved, it counts. Well, how often does this occur? How often does so-and-so hit a home run? How often, we had lots of statistics in COVID, in the pandemic, where we were tracking. And in that case, you have to set parameters. You set a population, you set a time frame. How many people died of COVID in the state of Georgia in the last month? So to do statistics, you have to count, but you have to set clear parameters of exactly what it is you're counting and what are the parameters within which you're counting that. Now, this arrives not as at invariant laws, because how often something occurs changes, and the statistics of the incidence of COVID has changed dramatically. And so thankfully, we're doing a webinar, but we're not, not all the students are out of class trying to learn online. So the goal of statistical science is to come up with averages. What is the average of how many men between the ages of 30 and 40 contract the flu each fall? And so then from that you get, well, the likelihood of getting the flu if you're a man between the ages of 30 and 40 living in Tennessee is 4 out of 10. So the goal of statistical science is trying to discover the likelihood of something happening. So the point is, this makes sense of chance events. I have to say, meteorology uses a lot of statistical science. We do this every day. When you check the weather, somebody is saying there's a 50% chance of rain tomorrow, right? And they're never going to get better than that, because that's this kind of science this is. Okay, so classical science studies what happens, such as the laws of motion in a home run, or the biology of conception. Statistical science then counts how often these events happen. How often is there a home run in this place at this time with this batter against that kind of pitcher? How often are children born or children conceived, et cetera, et cetera. So we have these two different ways. Now they're not contrasting and they study the exact same events. It's just that they asked different questions of those events. Okay, so what's the point here? The point is that both classical and statistical science make sense. So in other words, if you like, we could say there's a way of making sense of chance, and we do it all the time. Now, it's not the kind of science that you get with, what causes Ebola or what causes COVID, but it's another kind of sense. So the intelligibility of system is what we get with classical science. The intelligibility of probability is what we get with statistical science. But the bottom line is that chance doesn't mean nonsense. If you're working with that, there's only one way the world unfolds according to some kind of determinism, that God hit the first domino, it all folds according to some pre-written plan. Then if you try to introduce chance, it seems like you're challenging that whole worldview. Well, yeah, you are. But the point is that there's more to the way the world unfolds than just dominoes. Just direct A causes B causes C causes D. Okay. So the point here is that it's just erroneous to say, well, there are all these random events. So of course there's no meaning. We can't make any sense of it. And therefore, God's not involved at all. So here's an example. Of course, now this is a strictly mathematical. You're dealing with, let's say, a quarter. So the average is 1 in 50 out of 100 times. The average is you're going to get heads. Now, an interesting twist here is that if you flip a coin 100 times, you can make a chart like this. But you're not going to get 50 flips that are heads and 50 flips that are tails. It's just the calculated average of what you might get, okay? And if this isn't getting too far down in the weeds, the interesting thing is that the actual incidences of heads or tails deviate, in fact, randomly from the average. If they don't, then there's something wrong with your quarter. We can get back to that if you want. But so in the same with rolling a dice, if you got a 6 every time, there's a problem here. But the number of times you actually, the chances of getting a 6 are 1 in 6. But if you actually got a 6 every 6th time you rolled the dice, that's a problem. That the dice is loaded somehow. anyway, we can come back if that's of interest to people. All right, now I'm going to introduce this notion of a scheme of recurrence. I'm trying to move all you people off to the side here. So a scheme of recurrence is when A causes B and B causes C, but here's the trick. C then causes A to happen again. So once you get a circle like this, a scheme of recurrence, if A happens, you know you're going to get B and C. And it starts a cycle where something happens over and over and over again. So instead of having to, reinvent the wheel each time, you get a recurrent set of relationships. Let's see. Oh, why is this not moving? So it's not just sort of A causes B, causes C, causes. So this is not the dominoes, but you get a setup where, something happens. If A happens, then you're pretty sure B and C are going to happen, and then A is going to happen again. I mean, this is your digestive system. You probably had dinner. So this is all kinds of sets of schemes of recurrence are going on in your stomach right now. But the other thing to notice is that once a scheme of recurrence gets set up and keeps recurring on a regular basis, the probabilities increase dramatically, right? If C is an event that you're trying to track, let's say it's a certain chemical reaction. Well, if you just were isolating that and saying, well, how often does C occur if A, just on a, how often does C occur? But if it's part of a scheme, then the chances that it's going to occur increase dramatically because then C is going to occur if A happens or if B happens, right? So you set it so it heightens these probabilities. And this is, well, we'll get to that. So Krebs cycle, I'm not a chemist, I'm not a biochemist, but this is apparently a very complicated way of diagramming a whole series of schemes of recurrence. So in this case, one set of reaction then kickstarts the next set of reactions that kickstarts the next set of reactions. So you end up with whole series of schemes of recurrence that then are also in a sequence themselves. This apparently is a set of processes that take place in a cell to try and deal with glucose. And it's happening now as we speak. But the point being, there are all these, again, ratchet back a million thousand years ago, and where you only had maybe one of these reactions in an amoeba of some kind. Then what had to happen, to get more complex life was that instead of just having A causes B, something got set up that, but then C makes A happen again, right? So these are building blocks of evolution, is these recurring, and once these get set up, then that sets a schedule of probabilities that makes the next set of reactions more likely, right? I'm going at this several different ways. Again, this is not my specialty, but this is how ecological cycles, the nitrite to nitrate, end up with oxygen in the atmosphere, and then how the nitrogen gets recreated from waste, and the whole thing is a big long cycle. So again, this is not a single scheme of recurrence, it's a whole set of schemes of recurrence that when this set gets spinning, then that makes this set, and then that makes that set, and then you have nitrogen in the air, and that makes life possible, and then those fish die or whatever, and you get this whole thing spinning around in circles. But this is what gives you the regularity, right? So we have, the way the world functions is a conditioned series of schemes of recurrence. We'll start with the hydrological cycle, the way water circulates. That gives us the opportunity to have nitrogen fixation, which makes plant life possible, which then gives herbivores something to eat, which then gives carnivores something to eat. So we have all these lower schemes, you see, in sets of schemes, then become the building blocks, and then they get into a whole nother set that makes possible the next thing that gets a whole nother. And so then they build all these different schemes of recurrence on top of one another. So schemes of recurrence are conditioned. There are probabilities of emergence and probabilities of survival. There are some, how do we put this? Some plants that quickly sprout up. The probability of their sprouting up is very quick and obvious, and so the seeds spread everywhere and they sprout up very quickly, but the probability of their survival is not very great. There are other things, and someone else could tell me, the pine cones that have to be released in a forest fire, or where something, the probability of it emerging is very low, but once in 10 years, when this pine cone or this type of tree finally comes, then it's there. I mean, this is assuming we don't destroy the forest, but so there are different probabilities of things emerging or things being sustained. Schemes of recurrence depend on the underlying manifold of events that constitute them. So once you get a scheme of recurrence, you're dealing with these regularities, but those regularities are dependent on all the other little bits underneath them, right? So in one sense, yes, science tries to teach us what's true forever and for always, regularities. But even those regularities are subject to probabilities, if you like, chance to what emerges or can emerge. And so schemes of recurrence depend on underlying manifolds. Series of schemes depend on the emergence and survival of constituent schemes of recurrence. So the interesting thing is when something begins to break down, what like evolution occurs because some of these series of schemes recurrence begin to break down. And then there's like a gap, and that opens up the possibility that some other set. Now, I mean, obviously it opens up the possibility of death, right? Or, a whole ecosystem declines. And then that makes it impossible for animals or plants dependent on that to decline. But at the same time, it opens up because, these schemes of recurrence are very regular, right? So once you get into them, nothing's going to change. So if something's going to change, it has to break down or break open somehow. And so it breaks open and again, could just be demise, or in very few little cases, it could become the conditions for something new to begin to create a new cycle and a new, and this is essentially how species emerge, right? You have to have some, and sustaining is, you get some kind of thing that where all the conditions are ripe, well, that species, that ecosystem can go on forever and ever. But sometimes they begin to break down, and then in addition to Neanderthal, we start moving towards Homo sapiens, right? So anyway, and in the end, it didn't turn out too well for the Neanderthal, but it's still so. So what's the big idea on evolution? Evolution is a matter of both regularity and probability. Chance versus law is a false polarity. Even chance can be made sense of, but not in the way, it's not a direct causality. It's just you can only predict with a likelihood. You can never say, yes, tomorrow the lightning will strike, and this, I mean, medicine works like this too, right? When someone gives you a treatment plan, they'll say, well, we could try A, B, or C. A, the outcomes would be really good, but the chances of them, happening are just sort of 30%. If we give you this other thing, it's probably going to do something. 90% of the time it does something, but it's only going to mitigate your condition, not really cure it. So we do these all the time. Evolution is not utterly random. Events are random relative to some pattern, right? If you know what the pattern is, and then you have, which is a generalization, right? Then you have specific events that deviate from the expected pattern, right? But the whole universe isn't random. It's all this interaction of this regularity and probability. And again, as I've just been saying, schemes of recurrence heighten the likelihood of further emergence. You have to build up certain sets of schemes of recurrence to make it possible for the next set to emerge or to be sustained. All right. Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, so that's a lot. And I've done a lot of talking. So we'll just pause for a minute and see if there's anyone wants to, and I will encourage you to use the react buttons. Now, let's see. I might need some help because I can't see everyone all at once.
I think when somebody puts their hand up on with the react button, I think they move towards the top. So hopefully we would see you easily.
And I'm happy to move on, but this is just, it's been a lot so far. So I just thought we'd pause in case somebody was confused.
Cindy, is one way of thinking of this is that context matters, so that if you're an African American, the chance of getting sickle cell disease is X. If you're Caucasian, chances of your getting sickle cell is much different.
Mm-hmm.
So in economics, we talk a lot about conditional probability, which is more or less what we're talking about here. So that depending upon the context of what's gone before, you're going to have a certain probability of something happening now.
Right.
So would that be a way of kind of summing it up?
Yes and no. It's more complicated when you get to human behavior.
Yeah.
Which, needless to say, we're going to have to get into if we start talking theology. So there are, because then we get into the world of choice and meaning and what kinds of meanings people ascribe to certain actions. I mean, in terms of economics.
Right.
So
I just meant
yes.
that we use statistics in economics is
Yeah.
all I'm
Oh,
saying.
absolutely.
And that's how we would describe, I think, what you're saying here is that context matters when you're doing probability, the likelihood of something happening. And we do that in if you take a look at voting behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Now they break it down by ethnic group and age and so forth,
right.
and they say the
That's
probability of
Right.
this particular subgroup voting this way
That's
is
right.
X. But if you had a
Correct.
different subgroup, you'd have Y.
Yes. And the thing, because of that, when you're doing probabilities, they always have to be redone. You know, if you figure out what causes Ebola, or COVID, and okay, there's a new strain of COVID. Yes, that's a whole new question, right? But once
Mhm.
you figure out what causes Ebola or COVID, you pretty well got it. Now, new cases come, new strains, blah, 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 blah. But with probabilities, you have to redo them all the time. You can't just say, well, the chances of getting Ebola in New York State in 2004 was such and such. Well, we got that one now. Okay, the chance of getting Ebola is no, it's not 2004 anymore.
Yeah.
So it is one of the weird things about statistics is that although you can come up with a generalization, which would be an average or a likelihood, you have to do those over and over again. There's a concreteness to it. That's, I think, what you mean by context.
Exactly. The underlying conditions change over time.
That's
So
right.
then you have to recalculate.
That's right. So
So let me,
that's why I say, that the objective of classical science is sort of abstraction and invariance. Oh, we got it now, we know, and that's how it's going to be, you know. But for statistical science, either, yes, they're abstractions, but it's a mathematical abstraction that then has to be recalculated. Yeah, I think that's what you mean by context.
Yeah.
So let me try to bring this to maybe a little closer to home to the folks here by asking it this way. What I think you're talking about underlies quite a few of the misconceptions of reality that are alive and in competition in our current culture. They are, in fact, underlying a lot of the present culture war. That because we don't understand statistics, because we are either overly given to determinism or not, we have certain political views, we have certain religious views, we demand that this is wrong because it doesn't accord with our misshapen view of how these things work. So I'm wondering if maybe you could just enumerate for us maybe the top 5 misunderstandings of reality that come from these things that you've been talking about, that might help us understand, oh, that's why this matters, to why when I get up tomorrow morning and turn the TV on, what is it I'm seeing that actually is reflected in the thing that you have been talking about?
Right.
Does that make sense?
I would, and this, as we go on, and I'll come more to the fore, but I would give a little bit of a history here, and we're going to go back to Newton and Newton's sort of mechanical determinism, in which he did think you could come up with one equation that would explain everything, right? And just before we got into this whole world of statistics. And so a lot of people, they have no idea who Isaac Newton was. And but a lot of people still have this image of the way the world has unfolded over time, the way the world works now, where A causes B causes C, and there's some like certainty involved, right? And people don't like, the problem with acknowledging the probability piece of the way the world unfolds is that you have to also acknowledge that there's a good deal of uncertainty. And
That'd be lying behind a bunch of conspiracy theories?
Yeah, you have to. So I think people don't, the current culture wars or whatever you want to call it, I think come down to how comfortable can people be with probabilities? How
Or
people
ambiguity?
ambiguity and uncertainty, and the fact that if things change and there is no clear mathematical formula, there is no forever and for always. And so the other thing, of course, I didn't mention here is that the biggest way we understand that the regularities that we can count on, we want to count on, are threatened, are conditioned, is global warming. I mean, in our lifetimes, I can say I lived in an era where I just assumed that the way the weather worked and the way, you know, the air circulated around the earth, or the oceans, the temperature of oceans, was just, we understand how that works, and it's just going to be the same forever and for always. And what's happened is we've shifted the conditions in all those cycles, right? And when those conditions get shifted, then everything has to adjust, right? Because it aims towards some kind of regularity, right? So once you shift conditions, then the whole system tries to regroup to get back to its lovely schemes of recurrence, right? I think that's, and I think a lot of reason why people are climate change deniers is that they want things to just be true forever and for always. You know, I think they don't, and because Robin knows, we have on the domain at the University of the South, we have someone who's a domain manager, and I would take Nate Wilson and I would take my classes out into the woods with Nate so that people could understand sort of what are the ethics of how we handle the woods or whatever. And I remember him saying, you know, our science of forestry always depended on patterns, knowing the patterns, even the probabilities, but knowing the patterns over the centuries of what happens when. And we're dependent on knowing those. And now, because of global warming, we can't do that science the way we always did it, because we really have no idea what the effect is going to be on our forests. So I'm sorry, I'm going on a little long, but I think, Jerry, what you're getting at is that people want to know. And they don't like anyone telling them that our future is subject to probabilities.
Yeah.
Let me move on, because this will get a little thicker here. All right. So the second move, Jesus died for our sins, ? Making sense of atonement today. So I've actually written a couple of books on this. This is the most recent one in 2016, called Transformed Lives, Making Sense of Atonement Today. It was published by Church Publishing in 2016. All right, so I'm just going to give you the quick rundown on this one, and then we'll see if it has anything to do with emergent probability. So atonement has to do with the work of Christ. What difference does his coming to earth make? I say the work of Christ in contrast to the person of Christ. In the early centuries, all those councils were trying to define who Christ was. Pretty well everyone was convinced something dramatic had happened. And it was a question of then trying to make sense of what, like, who was that masked man? What did we know? Our lives have changed. How do we explain that? The English word atonement doesn't have a lovely Greek heritage. It's an English word. Reconciliation of estranged parties, bringing created reality back into relationship with the creator. It presumes brokenness or alienation that needs resolving. Theologies of atonement have never been defined by the church. In those early centuries, there were a lot of councils defining Jesus being both human and divine, and lots of debate over the person of Christ. But it's really just been a number of different images and ways of explaining what difference does it make. And so over the centuries, we've come up now, what I'm going to call the popular view. And again, I'm jumping over a whole host of theologies and a whole history of theology. But suffice it to say that we do now have circulating this notion of Jesus paying a price. The lower one there says he didn't just die on the cross, he died for you. So more and more over the centuries, and again, the reasons for this I'm not going to bother with, the focus came more and more on the crucifixion. Salvation and atonement revolves around the cross rather than Jesus' teaching, Jesus' birth, the incarnation. The focus has been more and more on the crucifixion. The popular view focuses primarily on crucifixion rather than Jesus' life or the resurrection. It sees the crucifixion as a punishment inflicted on Jesus, and this punishment was the death we all deserve because of sin. Jesus bore this punishment in our place, which grants us salvation, and that was all part of God's plan. So the focus is on the cross and on punishment and this vicarious, this substitutionary, Jesus standing in our place. The penal substitutionary theory of atonement is the technical term for this popular view. Penal means it has to do with punishment in a court of law. Substitutionary is the part where Christ paid the price, suffered in place of us. And it envisions a kind of transaction in which an exchange took place, instigated by the Father and carried out by the Son in a kind of legal way that gives us sort of a free pass, if you like. So the problems with atonement. Jesus I like, but the Father seems pretty mean. Why is God always so angry? These are responses of children. It gets to it does seem kind of, why would God do that? Sorry, I'm going the wrong way. The penal substitutionary theory does not, in fact, carry the full weight of biblical warrant. In fact, it's not in there at all. My colleague Bob Hughes, may he rest in peace, just passed away last Sunday. But he used to say to his classes, I'll give $50 to anyone who can actually find this full-blown penal substitutionary theory in a biblical account. And to my knowledge, he never did have to fork out those $50. Anselm, who lived in the 1000s, the 11th century, seems to be the source of this, because he talks about satisfaction, how Jesus came to earth to earn satisfaction for us. It tends to understand Anselm's notion of satisfaction incorrectly. I'm not going to explain that tonight. It's just one of myriad ways of understanding God's work of reconciliation with us. So there are lots, and again, Bob Hughes had a whole handout with like 25 different ways that you could understand what happened to get us salvation. It reflects an individualistic transactional model of justice. It neglects the incarnation, Jesus' life and resurrection, as in fact part of the reconciliation process. The most telling recent critiques, this is now a boom industry in the last 22 centuries. The most telling recent critiques come from feminist pacifists in the work of Renee Girard. Pacifists, of course, don't like the fact that there's so much violence involved. And feminists find it the ways that this kind of theory has been detrimental to women, because it seems to glorify suffering. And then women are simply told that their suffering is earning them salvation. We can talk more about Renee Girard, but he has a whole, talks about scapegoats and how this tends to buy into this whole way of scapegoating people. The popular penal view of atonement put violence at the heart of God's character. God uses violence to solve the problem of evil. Well, that's problematic. And it also seems to pit one person of the Trinity, the Father, against another, the Son. So again, then instead of going through a whole history of theology, I'll give you 4 points that we're going to pull out from St. Paul to try and give a thicker understanding of all this, as opposed to that simplistic transaction thinking. Whatever the atonement achieved, it was in order that we might live new lives in Christ. That's the key, is new lives. Christ's work was for us, not because God needed something in order to love and accept us. So one of the flaws of this penal substitutionary view is the idea that that God needed something. Well, God is God. The problem was ours. It really wasn't a problem for God. It was God reaching out in love and trying to do something so that we could be reconciled. Christ's death is part of God's action in reconciling us to God's self, but not as a substitution for our death. This is really not in Paul. The key point in Christ's sacrifice is his love and his willingness. This is also the heart of Anselm, should you care. The key point in Christ's sacrifice is his love and willingness to abide in God in spite of oppressive evil powers aligned against him at the price of his life. I always like to say, Jesus did not choose suffering as a route to salvation. Jesus chose love and accepted suffering. And that's a very, very different thing. So and this is certainly with Paul, was that Christ came in love and chose love, and it happened to get him crucified. The resurrection, our own as well as Christ, is as much a part of the reconciliation achieved in Christ's event as is the crucifixion. For Paul, the center of the gospel is our participation in the new life of the risen Lord. This participation means sharing in his death, which means embracing our own death to the sin that enslaves us, as well as a willingness to suffer the consequences of following Christ. I think the bottom line here is this, what's erroneous theologically is this notion that there's some kind of that suffering in some way is a good thing because it yields salvation. Suffering equals salvation. No, does not compute. That is not how this works. And not to say that there isn't suffering involved, because it's risky. This is very risky business. You choose love, you choose to follow love, you're probably going to suffer. If you want to grow and grow out of your own sin, you're going to have to die. There are parts of you that will have to die, and the martyrs actually did die, right? So it's not to say there isn't suffering or even death, but that's not the agent. That's not the causal agent of salvation. Okay, what about today in the modern world? Again, hundreds of years, 500 years, the rise of modern science, the rise of historical criticism, the rise of modern psychology. There are many, many things that I can't go into, but I will just shift and say we have become more and more cognizant of religious experience, and that now we talk about what is the experience of this journey, of this transformation. Both in retrieving past meanings and understanding current meanings, theology is in fact about conversion. Right from the opening chapter of Mark, that metanoia that was Jesus' first preaching. It's time to change. How were believers in the past drawn out of themselves into God? How are we so drawn in our lives today? The key point is that theology is not about abstract categories independent of human life. Still, we can delineate some parameters. So theology is not about it's not a bunch of doctrines. It's not a bunch of statements you agree to. It can be that eventually, but it's really about living into a narrative and living into this dramatic change of our lives. So there aren't clear, it's not as simple as just sort of transactions, abstract category, are you saved or not saved? But we can delineate some parameters to define authentic living, specifically authentic religious living, and what will happen, what will life look like when these events do take place. So changed lives all involved, these are just a phenomenology of noticing that changed lives involve a deep longing for God, an ongoing saga of death and resurrection, just no way to get around that, a relationship with God, communities of faith, a life of worship, a life of service, and growth towards a gentle acceptance of our reality. So the gospel is transformation. Today is about meaning making. God enters into our drama of making sense of our lives. It's not an already out there now real. It's not something that, some tabloid in God's somewhere out there where we're on a list or not on a list. And it's not an already back there then transaction, some transaction that took place 2,000 years ago that we simply benefit from. Atonement is not a past accomplishment, but also a current process. In deleting all the other slides I could have deleted, I just couldn't resist this quote from Rowan Williams that gets at the heart of it. God's offer of friendship. Grace for the Christian believer is a transformation that depends in large part on knowing yourself to be seen in a certain way, as significant as wanted. The whole story of creation, incarnation, and our incorporation into the fellowship of Christ's body tells us that God desires us as if we were God, as if we were that unconditional response to God's giving that God's self makes in the life of the Trinity. We are created so that we may be caught up in this, so that we may grow into the wholehearted love of God by learning that God loves us as God loves God. So we're really entering into this triune relationship of love. So this involves breaking dysfunctional cycles. We talked about schemes of recurrence. Let me throw this out. So schemes of recurrence in human life are habits. you have a habit. You do this, that happens, that makes this happen, that makes it happen, and you do it all over again, right? So good habits are virtues, bad habits are vices. But and we have these same cycles in human communities where we have cycles of victims and abusers. We have addictive cycles that keep on repeating themselves. So we have schemes of recurrence, if you like, in human community and human life, some of which are life-giving and some of which are dysfunctional or are detrimental to us. So this transformation is really a question of breaking a cycle, a victim cycle, to one of a healing cycle. And it happens through asking for healing and asking for forgiveness. This is very much what Alcoholics Anonymous is talking about, is this shifting these cycles and turning them around, breaking one cycle, but then shifting it so it becomes a more constructive cycle. And you can think in terms of evolution, if you like, these schemes of recurrence, that you have to build different ones on the bottom, so to speak, so that new relationships and other things can be built on top of that. So breaking the cycle, reconciliation is not a logical deduction. It's not direct causality, A causes B. It's not brought about by force or coercion. It's not a matter of redemptive violence or redemptive suffering. Reconciliation is an entirely new horizon of meaning, a reversal, a conversion. It comes initially as a gift, something given yet chosen. It becomes possible when evil is exposed for what it is, and it does have a cost. It includes sacrifice. We're almost there. So finally, what would all that other stuff I talked about in terms of emergent probability, how would that fit into this whole theology of atonement? Well, and here this occasion has gotten me thinking on this. Perhaps the flaws in penal systematic theology are not just theological, although they definitely are. God is not violent at God's heart. But perhaps there's an underlying flaw, and I think maybe it's part of what Jerry was getting at earlier, in conceiving just how the world works, how the world unfolds. Perhaps it assumes a kind of mechanistic determinism. Everything flows by regular causal events. Salvation is a transaction. It's some kind of mathematical thing, and you can come out on a plus or a minus. I put in predestination ? And I'm afraid to say that because I don't know Calvin. I don't know the reformers well enough, but it did make me wonder whether predestination emerged out of, trying to have, dominoes hitting one another. These things are determined ahead of time. But so I'm wondering if, part of the problem with this view of atonement isn't just the theological piece, but this misconstruing of just how the world unfolds. Conversion and transformation is subject to probabilities. Salvation cannot be it's not A causes B. It can't be programmed or forced. Once someone encounters the other, certain things do unfold with regularity. But when and how one has such an encounter is not predetermined. There are conditions that can make it more likely, but it's still a matter of probabilities. There are conditions that increase the likelihood of such encounters. So this means there are pastoral implications. Discipleship is a matter of undertaking practices to heighten our own and others' chances of connection with the divine. But it's not there's no clear formula. You can't just say, well, if you do this or if you do that, then of course you'll be saved or you'll know God or you'll have a religious experience. No, you just undertake certain practices, and that heightens the likelihood that you'll have an encounter with God or that you'll have an encounter with others, etc. So ministry is a matter of setting, this is my little mantra I used to say to my students. Ministry is a matter of setting the conditions of possibility for transformation. That's all it is, but that's a lot. So what you need to do is not force something, not manipulate something, but it's a matter of creating conditions of possibility so that transformation becomes likely. of both individuals and of an entire community. So I'm just going to end with these pictures of it's all of this is about emergent probability, the history of humankind and the growth of a flower, and in healing and forgiveness. So that's it. And I had said that I would take time for clarification questions. There may not be any. We may just want to jump into discussion.
So at this point, we might ask, does anybody want something clarified? If not, we can start discussing. Would you raise your hand with your react button if somebody has a question that they need clarified? I don't see any. Then maybe I'll jump in. It seems to me, Cindy, that the theological aspect and the evolutionary aspect are closely aligned. I've been thinking a lot about maybe we could stop sharing too, so we can all see one another.
Yes. All right. Let me take that off. Yeah.
There we go. Thank you. It strikes me that a loving God allows freedom. Somebody who loves allows the other to be who they are and doesn't attempt to control them. And the Bible is full of God's delighting in God's creation. And when you delight in something, it's the serendipity that's delightful. If we had a bunch of little wound-up children, wind-up children running around, they wouldn't be nearly as delightful as children that keep surprising you. And I think that's why adults can sit and watch children forever, because they're always doing things you never expected. So that's what makes them fun. And so loving parents don't control their children. They attempt to guide them and help them become all that they could be without forcing them to become something in their own mode. In fact, if we try to do that, we create problems. So it strikes me that analogy is very similar to what you've laid out with the notion of probabilistic processes in evolution. That's a sign to me of a loving God. It's a sign to me of somebody who collaborates with the material but doesn't force it any one way. What do you think about that?
Well, I agree with you, although I'm trying to think, I think it's more than just God gave us free will.
No, what I'm saying is it's not just us, it gives all creation free will.
Yes, that's right. That it folds in this dynamic interaction, right? And in which but once we get to human life, it's a question of cycles of meaning, right? I mean, here's an interesting thought that why did Jesus come into the culture and at the time that he did? Is that a matter? I don't think it's an interventionist thing. I don't think God woke up one day and said, "Oh, today's the day." I think it was somehow that these cycles of meaning in the Jewish tradition and however those things unfolded led to this opportunity. Right. In that this happened, it happened to be when it was as these various things. So I think it's more that dynamic interactionist way the world unfolds. Right. That's what I'm trying to get at. This is just the way the world works.
Right. Right.
And so it's not God tinkering. Just as we try to get away from this image of God tinkering by poking his finger into creation.
Right.
Well, seems true with our own conversion salvation, right? God offers conditions of possibility for our transformation.
Right.
And there are, we talk about prevenient grace, right? Which I think is like the conditions set up for us to get actual grace. I'm not quite sure the technical meaning of those terms.
Jerry, do you have something you'd like to offer before I throw in something else?
Well, yeah. I mean, all of, the biggest, so I'm just talking about me. Um, the biggest struggle maybe I have had with faith in my adult life by giving full weight to evolution and to the size of the universe and the minuscule, grain of sand that we are on, and what that means for the Christian story. My struggle is to align to receive the Christian story in a way that makes sense in an evolving 14 billion year old universe. The Christian story, as we have been enculturated and as we have been received and as we still sing it and as we still dance it, is we were one time okay and then we broke something. And the languages of breaking, even the language of reconciliation, implies a conciliation at one time, and that there was something that was there that we threw away, and now it needs to be recovered, and God has stepped in to an attempt a recovery, or let's say more than an attempt, to accomplish our recovery. But that's not the story of evolution. Evolution says we never were. And we just haven't got there. And theologically, we might say yet.
We never were what?
We never were complete in the whole, and then we blew it. There was never a blowing. And which calls into question, what are we saying sin is? And because what we say sin is determines what we say salvation is. And if we not ever actually, if we actually are just the creatures of evolution that much of biology says we are, then it's actually, we're not acting brokenly, we're acting normal. Normal's just not that great. Normal is war and jealousy and egocentrism and competition, is also cooperation and love and grace and peace and all those other things. But I guess I'm kind of like, I wonder if in the pew, a lot of people's problem with Christianity is they've never made the reconciliation of the Christian storytelling that we have received in an evolving world that we know to be true. And so I guess my maybe a question to everybody or to you is, how do we heal that and own in full voice without hesitation our full-bodied reality and what is God trying to do here?
Well, you've said a lot of things and I have a lot of thoughts. The fall, this notion that you said that there was a good time and we blew it, and the problem there is different genres of literature, basically. And that we have a narrative that works in what I call picture thinking, that has carried the Christian tradition, Judeo-Christian tradition for a long time. And in fact, Genesis, the way Genesis started with, oh my gosh, we have wonderful people, but why is everything so screwed up? I mean, they just started with reality, just exactly what you're talking about, right? Here's our reality. And they tried to talk about it by telling a story of, well, there are two different, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, 3, 4 different stories, but by telling a story about the Garden of Eden in the fall, right? That it's just a different way. It's different way of, it's one way in which a certain people tried to deal with this lack of, this disconnect between wonderful life and really destructive life. So I think, but then, evolution is not that story. So anyway, I think there's a disconnect in just genre. I mean, there's sort of picture thinking, which has its role and is helpful, but it's also not science, right? So then in the science thing, we have all these different things emerging over billions and billions of years. What I see is that what I call the upward mobility of the whole thing. The upward mobility towards system, towards order, towards, greater system that keeps everything moving to, when there's a breakdown, no, we're going to regroup. We're going to get a new system. I think in humans, that upward mobility is all the questioning we do, are the brilliance of this yearning we have. I think the problem is that we mistake that yearning for accomplishment. In other words, our yearning for God, we think, oh yeah, we got that. We think that means we're God. We're in control. We mistake the potential for thinking it is up to us. And that's where the sin part comes in. That's not really dealing with everything you were saying, but you were asking a lot, Jerry.
Yeah, and a phrase I've kind of come up with is for sin kind of is maybe just a falling short, of course, has been a useful definition, but of a falling short, not of our past, but a falling short of our future.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that changes some of the import of the language we use in our liturgies and so on and so forth. That sin.
Yeah, of course, what I've been trying to get at is the falsity of, like, this, whatever sin is and whatever its redemption is an ongoing process of death and resurrection.
Yeah.
But it's also not a clear transaction.
Right.
It's messy. It's just messy.
Well, Mary, I think there might be stuff in the.
There is a lot in the chat, a lot of comments, as well as some questions. So I'll go back a bit to David Stokesbury says, at the most fundamental level, quantum physics is stochastic. I think this was going back to commenting when you were, in the first half of your presentation. I don't know if you want to comment on that or just, but I can also, Dave has a lot of comments as well. Dave says, I see monoculture seeking diverse culture, conformity seeking possibility, as it was becoming as it will be. And the steadfast love is not the stuckness of how God was in the past, as we remember, but the continual unfolding of God's intention, fluid and becoming. And it looks like he's referencing or is saying he thinks he's referencing Teilhard. Then he says, let's see, Jesus said, let's try male and female, slave and free, let's delight in all, and let's welcome a kingdom of heaven. And the question, does God play with tinker toys in a mechanistic way or breathe imagination and creativity an expansive universe?
Well, I'll pick up on that one. I'm really against the idea of God tinkering. And one of the other things that's important here is distinguishing what we call primary and secondary causality. So if we say, did God cause the drought? Did God cause the sun to shine? The answer is yes and no. Yes, because God created a universe in which all these schemes of recurrence occur, which mean that we have sunshine. The answer is no, in that all these things function independent of God. We have all these secondary causalities. So I'm strongly against the idea of God tinkering or playing dice or any of those kinds of things. I think God is number one, God is always already there. So it's not as if, except for, of course, evil, which is by definition the absence of God. So no, I don't like this idea of God sort of shifting things around. I think and then we are in the flow trying to make as much sense as we can and make the changes we need to. But again, we have to be sober about what we can do. We can't save ourselves. We can't save other people. We can simply shift conditions to hope that new schemes of recurrence open up.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Let's see. The other two comments we have are comments more than questions. That was the one big question. But Sonia says, if the system is evolutionary, there was never a fall. There was nothing to fall from. So I guess, that's a comment, I guess, on what Jerry was saying too.
Yeah. And again, I think they're just two totally different. We're just in two different modes of conversation there. I think attempts to try and put a fall of some kind into human evolution is just misguided.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the last, oh no, there's more comments I see down here. Okay, Dave again says, the vehicle is not broken. Evolution joins a wheel to an axle, to a brake, to a door, to a seat, and away we go. We're becoming what God is imagining. Do we pay attention? We need the scientist and the poet. Amen. Yeah. I'm all for the scientist and the poet. Right. But Dave does have a question. It says, so yearning is less about accomplishment and more about hunger?
Well, again, yeah, no, but the yearning is the basis of it. I mean, we don't want to mistake our yearning for accomplishment and think we have more power than we do. But the yearning is really the base of it. The yearning is God already in us, right? Drawing us back to God. So what is my role? Is it an accomplishment? No, because of course it's always grace, but it's this interaction of, am I going to live into and keep on creating new possibilities for myself to encounter God and for others to encounter God through me. But we don't accomplish any, we just flourish. I mean, we do what we can to flourish, and whatever is, quote, produced is what it is. But we're not always in control of that.
Yeah, Dave also has a follow-up comment, says, sin is falling short of our future.
Yeah.
Definition of sin.
Yes, but it's also, but part of authentic living is accepting the limitations of what our future might hold.
Yeah, that's important. Those are all the comments and questions from the chat so far. Does anyone else have anything? I think I got them all.
You just dropped one. Just small one. She just dropped a little small, quick question.
Oh, yeah. Here we go. Yes. So what do you mean when you use the word salvation and or save?
Again, I think
Awesome, yeah.
For me, it's important to get out of this sort of either or dichotomy, like saved from what? Hell, sin, So it's that's why I use the language of transformation, because it's a journey and we're always in death and resurrection over and over and over and over again. So salvation to me is just a matter of choosing to receiving the grace and entering into that journey and entering into that lifetime of death and resurrection. But there's no chit where you say, yesterday I wasn't saved and today I am.
But I'll add to a piece to that, though, that comes from a lot of theology, which is, yes, salvation is entering into the life of God, I suppose, but it is also God's empowering us to enter into the life of God. So there is that's a good theological question. Is there a pro-action of God toward us that is prevenient grace that enables us to be saved? Salvation meaning the life of God. Also,
Well, I think the whole thing's set up for that.
yeah.
And God, but again, how do we picture? This is the picture thinking, right? Like, do we picture God? So if my journey was radically altered because someone came into my life and began talking to me, and so did God tinker and make that person come into my life? I don't think so. I think God is always already at work, and it's a question of our opening our eyes to see that.
I guess it's the mystics who talk about our capacity to desire, just having the capacity. But then that begs a question for those that desire has been beat out of them.
Yes.
What do we do with that? And that's why I was sarcastic about Sonia's small little question.
Well, but I know what I was going to say to that. That the root meaning, a salve, is healing.
Yeah.
So salve is healing. So salvation is being healed. So it is that what I was trying to show, those pictures of breaking the cycle and turning the cycle around. That's salvation, is turning, but you have to reconfigure, you have to set a whole new community, sometimes a whole new set of meanings that reinforce one another, so that something else can get built on it. So I think it is an ongoing process of finding what's the next little piece in our communities, in our lives, to reorder.
It also might help to allow the word salvation to actually not be about individuals. That is one of the huge Western problems, is we think of salvation as each person's salvation rather than the salvation of all creation, of which we are living into. That way we might not have to worry so much about the answer to the question, and where the desire for God gets beat out of somebody in a given lifetime. What does that mean? And
I know we're coming to our time to close, but I really wanted to say this, that to me, when you use that beat out, to me, this deep desire for God is the baseline of everything. And the worst sin, I would say, I don't know, can you, but not only individual sins, but systemic sins, is when certain persons are told or treated as if they didn't have that desire, as if they couldn't ask those questions. Women are too stupid to ask those questions, Blacks and other minorities. So that, to me, that is like just the worst systemic sin, is when you have a whole set of practices and narratives and meanings that tell one person or a whole group of people that they don't have that desire, that they can't ask questions, that they're too stupid. I find that, and that's why when people get an education, have you seen people who haven't been able to have an education, and the light goes on? I mean, think Helen Keller, right? I mean, whoa, this is a revolution when people, and so to me, sorry, you got me in a soapbox. To me, telling people that you have questions to ask, you go for it, is the most powerful salvation. Yeah.
all right, we better quit while we can.
Yeah. Right. Before we bring up another big question. We've solved all the ones so far, so we're doing well. Well, this has been a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.
For bearing with me in all my complex.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us and your insight, and Jerry for chiming in here, and Mary for the chat, and for all of you for coming tonight so we could share this together. This will few days, this will be on our website if you want to go back and revisit. It'll be on, you can, we have a YouTube channel, we post them there, and then you can either go to YouTube and look up Center for Deep Green Faith, or go to our website. Either place you can find our videos. So have a blessed evening. Hopefully we can see each other on the 19th of November. Blessings.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.